Soering.
New DNA evidence could clear the name of Soering.
The jaw-dropping decision in the case of Soering.
Soering, a German national, was convicted of murdering his girlfriend's parents. It was a love story gone wrong.
You lied, didn't you?
She said, I killed my parents.
A pact that would forever bind them.
We now know two things.
Do you know of any reason why this court should not now pronounce judgment in your case?
I'm innocent.
It was not Soering.
He said that he killed my parents.
And Elizabeth Haysom.
Elizabeth
Haysom's.
Were they guilty?
You knew he was going to do it, didn't you?
This were two lovers who turned on each other.
That was silly.
There is a killer.
Yeah, I felt I didn't have any choice.
Jens acted of his own free will. He had a choice.
Still at large.
The two of them were a horrible puzzle that fit together just right.
Who's lying now? And why?
I got off on it. It was about me.
Then they switched back again.
Did they even commit the murders?
I did it myself.
Because Jens and I were obsessed with each other.
And if not them, then who? Polish students Jan Soering and Elizabeth Haysom were in love, but there was something in the way. Her parents. And so the couple made a murderous plan to kill Elizabeth's parents with the utmost brutality. And the question was why? And now, more than 30 years later, after their convictions, more questions have come up. It was described as a crime of pure hatred when on April 3rd, 1985, authorities discovered two bodies in the Haysom home of loose chippings just outside Lynchburg, Virginia. The victims were Derek Haysom and his wife Nancy, and while at first there was little information to go on, detectives would soon zero in on two suspects, the couple's 20-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and her boyfriend, Jens. It was a puzzle of horror that fit perfectly together, filled with twists and turns that would last for over 30 years. Our story starts in Bedford County, Virginia. It was described as a wonderful small town with very little crime, but on April 3rd, the bodies of the Haysoms were found, butchered. When crime scene security arrived at the home to secure the scene, even they were shocked by the brutality they were witnessing. Inside, sprawled across the house, were the bodies of Nancy and Derek. Their throats had been cut so violently and with such force that they were almost decapitated. They'd also been stabbed numerous times. Authorities estimated that they had been dead for at least 2 days. Derek was a South African national who had gained Canadian citizenship and was president of the Sydney Steel Corporation. The couple were described as well-known socialites who regularly played bridge and spent time at the country club. Derek was a little quiet but straightforward, intelligent, and conservative. However, it was well known that he had made enemies through his businesses. It wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility that one of them had done this. And Nancy was also an upstanding citizen in the community. She was actually related to the first female member of parliament. She valued pedigree and standing within her community. Derek modeled himself off of Winston Churchill, and Nancy after her many great ancestors before her. Both of them had been married before. Nancy had 2 sons, Howard and Richard, while Derek had 3 children, Varian, Julian, and Fiona. Yet, the blended family had a good relationship. Nancy and Derek shared only 1 child together, and this was Elizabeth, who was 10 years younger than her half-siblings. Elizabeth was a spitfire. She was known to dress in all black and have her hair cut short and spiky and was the essential punk girl of Bedford. And she lit up any room she walked into, and she was very, very different from her parents, although they seemed on the outside to have a very good relationship. At the time Nancy and Derek's bodies were discovered, Elizabeth was actually up at the University of Virginia, completely unaware of what had happened to her parents. The lead investigator for the Bedford County Sheriff's Office at the time was Chuck Reed. He described it as the worst homicide he had ever seen in his career. It was like a slaughterhouse, and all those who entered would report they could even smell and even taste the blood. Derek Haysom had been stabbed 36 times and his throat cut from ear to ear, with every major structure in his neck severed. And Nancy's death was even worse. She had actually tried to run and had been grabbed from behind with her throat forcefully slit. She'd been wearing a gold necklace at the time, which was found stuck deep inside her windpipe. The blood on the kitchen floor where she lay was so thick that it had pulled up and crusted away from the tiles, forming like a black lava-like layer across the floor. The scene was one of pure hatred. Over 1,000 pictures were taken of the scene, and initially it was suspected it was a satanic killing because certain things in the pictures just didn't make any sense, like strange markings that were found next to the bodies, and Derek had like a V cut into his chin, and blood had also been purposely smeared around the contours of the bodies in a weird artistic pattern. So we can wonder, was this a deliberate act or an attempt to cover up any evidence left behind by the killer? Ricky Gardner, another investigator, interrogated the neighbors to see if anyone had heard or had seen anything, but no one had. And the rumors around Bedford about a group of Satanists out murdering people only intensified. I mean, how else could you explain the strange scene, markings, and the violence of the killings? There had been no forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. So what was the motive? Everyone was suspicious of each other, and theories swirled around town about who had done it and why. And it only got worse as authorities refused to give up any information. But the truth was that they didn't know. They had no leads, no motive, and were working overtime to put the pieces together. And sure, they had tons of evidence, including a bloody sock print on the floorboard. Blood had also been found in the bathroom, indicating that the killer had tried to clean up after the murders before leaving the property. Hair was also found in the sink that didn't match Derek or Nancy, but the scene was also bizarre. I mean, it looked like the Haysoms had been interrupted while having dinner, because their plates were still on the table, and there was a bowl of ice cream splattered with blood. All signs pointed to a surprise attack, and it looked personal. It was 4 days after their murder that attention turned to Elizabeth, the Haysom's youngest daughter. After she was contacted, she organized the funeral, and for the most part, the community of Bedford was extremely empathetic towards her. I mean, Elizabeth was only 20 years old and had unimaginably lost both of her parents. As she appeared back in Bedford, she came across as the epitome of a loving daughter. 5 days after the murder, investigators interviewed Elizabeth as a precaution. It was entirely informal, and she was cooperative, and she even told investigators that her parents only locked the front door when they went to bed, so it would make sense that entry was easy for the killer. Now, during the interview, it was noted that she displayed remarkable intelligence and grace. She was well-spoken, but she never showed any emotion, which was strange considering what had happened, but then again, people grieve differently, right? Maybe Elizabeth was processing the death of her parents in her own way, which is totally understandable. Investigators asked Elizabeth where she had been that weekend. She explained that she was a freshman at the University of Virginia, and she and her boyfriend had decided to go on a getaway to Washington, D.C. to go sightsee, and drove back to Charlottesville on the Sunday. She was forthcoming, even giving the details of the rental car agreement the pair had while traveling. It was only a few days after this informal interview that something strange was noted. Investigators got hold of the rental car agreement Elizabeth had signed. 669 miles were put on that car that weekend, and here's where it gets interesting. It's a 120-mile drive from DC to Charlottesville. So why was there an extra 440 miles on the car? On the 16th of April, with this new information in mind, investigators met with Elizabeth again and asked her about the car. She simply said she and her boyfriend Jens had gotten lost multiple times on the way to DC, and this also didn't make sense. It was a straight shot route from Charlottesville to DC, almost impossible to get lost. So once again, Elizabeth was forthcoming, offering up her fingerprints and her footprints, trying to make herself seem, not guilty, but still the story didn't make sense. Should have been a 240-mile trip when investigators added in the miles it would also take to get to Lynchburg. It added up to roughly 669 miles, and this was a major red flag, because the investigators asked for Jens' contact information so they could verify the claim, and Elizabeth said she would get him to contact them, but surprise, surprise, never did. They even showed up his apartment in Charlottesville, but he was never there. It was strange and definitely seemed like he was avoiding speaking to investigators, which sparked alarms, and they would have to dig deeper. So how did Jens and Elizabeth, two very different people in their looks and demeanor, come to get together? Both showed up to college as Eccles scholars, in the top 6% of students for the incoming year. Jens Soering was the son of a diplomat dispatched from Germany to Atlanta. He went to a private high school and was both an Eccles and Jefferson scholar. No one really knew what Elizabeth saw in him. He was nerdy, arrogant, and described as unbearable. Simply being in the same room as him was torture. Just no one liked it. But for some reason, Elizabeth did. The pair met in August when school started, and they were carrying their belongings to the dorms. Jens spotted an attractive girl and struck up a conversation with her. But then he noticed her roommate, Elizabeth, and she was unlike any creature he had ever seen. Elizabeth had that effect on people. She was like a rare yet poisonous flower. They were introduced to each other that evening at a student barbecue. And initially, Elizabeth thought Jens was rude, but brilliant. To Jens, Elizabeth had led this daring, crazy life, and she had traveled, done drugs, ran away from school, and experimented with other girls. She was kind of going both ways. She also smoked cigarettes, unlike the other girls. And Elizabeth was also an outsider in a way, because she was a foreigner, just like him, with a lilting British accent. There was a significant age difference between them, but Jens didn't really care. And she was a highly sought-after commodity, with both boys and girls gunning for her attention. She and Jens grew closer, often discussing their love of literature. They both had an interest in writing and spent time writing each other letters and diary entries. Eventually, the letters got a little bit more passionate, and Elizabeth would write to Jens, describing her love for him as a selfish and painful, and she claimed he'd knocked down her defenses and that he was the only person she'd ever loved. This was a shock for Jens, who so far hadn't had that much luck in the love department. Here was a worldly, sexually mature, gorgeous woman, and she wanted him. So he wrote back to her expressing his love, and the pair formed a very deep bond. Jens felt totally accepted and received the affirmation he had always desired. But there was something else he desired, and that was exploring his sexuality. And with Elizabeth, this had all become possible. It was Jens' first time, and there was nothing quite like that first hit. Soon, he was addicted to Elizabeth, to all that she had to offer. In September, months after the murders, investigators asked Elizabeth for more samples, including blood and hair. They also sampled blood and footprints from other suspects, trying to match them to the bloody sock print found at the scene, but nothing matched. And eventually, on October 6th, Jens agreed to drive to Bedford County to speak to the detectives. When he arrived at the station, the investigators were unimpressed. He seemed like a nerd with thick black spectacles and a pitful demeanor, hardly what anyone would think of when you think of killer. But what Jens lacked in physical prowess, he more than made up for in intellect and arrogance. When he was shown the evidence of the extra miles on the car, he explained they did a lot of driving around Washington. But of course, investigators didn't believe him. They asked for his fingerprints, footprints, blood samples, but Jens outright refused. His response was strange. He said, "Being German, I don't like police," referring to how his grandfather had been harassed by. But if he was innocent, wouldn't he want to eliminate himself from the suspect list? I mean, why the resistance? Investigators realized he was trying and failing to outsmart them, so they resorted to an old trick. Good cop, bad cop. Investigator Reed told Jens that he didn't believe he committed the murder, whereas Gardner played the bad cop and told Jens that he thought he was involved. But Jens refused to be moved. He told Reed and Gardner that he would eventually go back to the university, think about offering up samples and prints, and then get back to them. But of course, on Sunday night at 10 p.m., Reed and Gardner got a phone call. Elizabeth and Jens had fled the country. Immediately, police had their suspects. Innocent people just don't run. I mean, it's so obvious. So the couple's car was found parked at the airport, and it was a race against time to contact Interpol and try to get the necessary warrants. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Jens made it to Paris, where they briefly set up base before driving to Luxembourg, and then to Yugoslavia. After some time there, they made their way to Italy, but they hadn't left without a word. They'd written detailed letters to their families and to Reed and Gardner, explaining that they were leaving. Jens's letter to Gardner taunted him, not admitting guilt, but relishing in the fact that he'd gotten away. After Italy, the pair went to Austria and then flew to Thailand. Because Jens had been born there, he thought he could gain citizenship and the pair would find jobs. But this was unsuccessful, and they had no choice but to leave. First to Malaysia, and then to England. They'd isolated themselves from everyone, run out of money, and realized that they were in deep, deep trouble. They needed a plan, and they found one, which worked for 6 months. On April 30th of 1986, Detective Sergeant Ken Beaver of the Richmond Police Department received a phone call from an in-store detective at a store in London. The detective had detained 2 suspects, a man and a woman who she suspected of fraud. They would bring in clothes and exchange them for cash, only speaking to each other once outside the store. Beaver told the detective to arrest them and bring them in, and when the pair arrived at the station, Beaver could just tell something was off and different about this case, but he just couldn't put his finger on what. Police then got the details of where the couple lived and raided the entire apartment. There they found fake IDs, diaries, wigs, letters, stolen clothing, and 2 passports with the names Jens Soering and Elizabeth Roxanne Haysom. The picture came together. The pair had forgeries made in Thailand. They were then able to get a checkbook, buy clothing on checks, and exchange it for cash by claiming it didn't fit. Basically, it was fraud, plain and simple, but masterfully done. By doing this, they managed to gain roughly £6,000, and they knew the system in and out. I mean, these certainly weren't first-time criminals. This was all so calculated. The letters were also collected and would have been dismissed had one detective constable, Terry Wright, not painstakingly read through them. There were certain extracts referencing Virginia and Gardner and Reed, and to the detective constable, it was clear something had happened in Virginia, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. One of the letters of importance was an exchange 3 months before the murders on December 21st, 1984. It was lengthy and written in diary form. In the extracts, Elizabeth wrote to Jens, "My mother is on her 6th gin. I pray she'll use the poker on my cold, goading father. Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents, do voodoo on them, and will them to death? Why don't my parents just lie down and die? I despise them so much." Of course, Jens responded to Elizabeth's letter describing their love as the ultimate weapon against her parents. But it was a little more sinister than that. He wrote, and I quote, "My God, how I've got the dinner scene planned out," end quote. It was eerie seeing that at the crime scene at the Haysom home, Nancy and Derek had been in the middle of eating when the killer showed up. But of course, it's not all he wrote. He said, and I quote, "I can see myself depriving people of their property quite easily. Your dad, for instance. Even more easily, I can see myself depriving many souls of their physical bodies." End quote. He made reference to a spate of burglaries that had happened in the loose chippings area and the possibility of pinning it on them. But here's the most chilling part. Jens also wrote, and I quote, "I've felt this. I'm feeling it now inside of me. This needs to plant one's foot in somebody's face to always crush. I have not explored the side of me that wished to crush any real extent. I've yet to kill. Possibly the ultimate act of crushing," end quote. These extracts, letters, and entries were a turning point in the case. Wright immediately found the details for Gardner and Reed in Virginia and contacted them on May 25th. He described what he had found in the letters and the couple that they had in custody. It seemed unbelievable. Immediately, Gardner drove up to the courthouse and spoke to the Commonwealth's attorney, Jim Updike, and explained the situation. And it wasn't long before they were on a flight to London, ready for retribution. Suddenly, as the news spread, it exploded in the British media, which described it as the voodoo killings and the black magic love. On June 5th, 1986, Elizabeth, now 22, and Jens, just 19, were questioned separately. These interviews lasted 3 days. Elizabeth had her solicitor by her side, and when she presented her with the letters found in the apartment, she refused to say anything. So Gardner turned to Jens for answers. Strangely, he chose not to have a solicitor. He seemed confident, as if he was in full control, and the story he was ready to tell was unlike what anyone expected. He said that he and Elizabeth had driven the rental car to the Marriott Hotel in Washington, and the next day he had driven back to Lynchburg, to Derek and Nancy's house. He said he was alone, and that Elizabeth was in D.C. at the cinema. He confessed that Elizabeth knew where he was going, but never entirely clear on what would happen while he was there. He claimed he was set to kill them during the interview, which was being recorded. He asked for the tape to be turned off and made the full confession to Gardner. He went through the confession a second time with Detectives Beaver and Wright in the room too. Jens then reenacted the murder and told them what had taken place. At the end of it, he told them, "I fell in love with a girl. We talked about killing her parents. I drove to her house and killed them. And I got caught." End quote. Both Elizabeth and Jens were indicted for murder after the confession. After hearing about Jens's confession, Elizabeth tried to make it clear that they were both equally guilty, admitting to her role in the murders and her knowledge of what would take place. In custody while awaiting extradition, she did something unexpected. She wrote to Jens, also in custody, and ended their relationship. She told him that she didn't love him anymore, and that from now on he was on his own. In May 1987, she was extradited back to Virginia, 2 years after the murders. She had appeared in court and her trial began. There was no resistance. She pled guilty as an accessory to the fact. She was nothing like what she had been before. Now she was demure, wore nothing of color, had long hair. She appeared as a kind of modern-day Joan of Arc to the public, where, like if she was submitting herself as a sacrifice. But it still didn't make any sense. I mean, why did she do it? By all accounts, she had a good relationship with her parents, or at least we thought, and what it seemed like from the outside. On the stand, Jim Updike asked Elizabeth why her parents died. She was slow to answer, but eventually said, and I quote, "My parents died because Jens and I were obsessed with each other, and he was jealous of anything other in my life," end quote. Meanwhile, Jens was still in custody back in England, fighting against extradition and hearing all of the details Elizabeth's case secondhand. On October 5th, 1987, the sentencing hearing for Elizabeth was held. She'd already pled guilty, but the community needed more transparency than just that. And so Elizabeth went into the details of what had occurred. She said that she and Jens had spontaneously decided to go to Washington on the 29th of March, 1985. She added that Jens had an impotency problem and the pair thought a getaway to Washington might solve that so he could, quote-unquote, get it together. She claimed that the next morning, the pair had an argument, and Jens was upset that she'd had to sell her jewelry because her parents weren't supporting her enough. As the argument continued, all of Jens' resentment towards Nancy and Derek just spilled all over. How they thought he wasn't good enough for Elizabeth, how he didn't have the proper pedigree or heritage, how he wasn't going to be a lawyer or a doctor. And Elizabeth elaborated that during this argument with Jens, he said he wanted to go to Loose Chippings and talk to them. She claimed she couldn't stop him, and that once Jens had an idea in his head, there was really no way to talk him out of it. Now, in Jens's version of events, he told investigators in London that he had arrived at the Haysom residence, knocked on the door, and when Derek answered, he just went inside. He had told the couple that he was on his way back to Charlottesville and just wanted to stop by. They all sat down and had a drink, and Jens began his speech. He asked for permission to date Elizabeth, but Derek was adamant that he would not allow the relationship to continue. But Jens wanted Elizabeth more than anything, including his freedom. So Jens claimed he stood up, grabbed a kitchen knife, and walked behind Derek before slitting his throat. Then he stabbed him over and over and over again. He had silenced Derek forever. Nancy tried to flee out the back door, but Jens ran up behind her, attacking and killing her. Now, Jens was forever bound to Elizabeth through murder. As Elizabeth battled it out in a televised trial, Jens's family tried to get him extradited back to Germany. Because if he were to be extradited back to Virginia, he would almost certainly face the death penalty, whereas in Germany, Jens could request parole after serving only 15 years. So Elizabeth continued on the stand, explaining that Jens was mainly to blame for the actual murder and that she had gone to see the Rocky Horror Picture Show that evening. Irony. Afterwards, when Jens showed up, she claimed he was wearing a bloody sheet. She said that he told her he killed her parents, and she was in a shock, but strangely, when they returned to the hotel, she cleaned up the blood in the car. I mean, how does someone clean up their own parents' blood and then go to sleep next to the person that literally killed them? I don't get it. Elizabeth claimed that she was just overwhelmed, and all she could think of was just how to save Jens and herself. So she described her feelings for Jens as an addiction, and that after her parents' death, she needed him more than ever. He was all that she had left. Jens, for his part, needed to be the center of Elizabeth's world, and now he was. In a letter written to him a few weeks after the murders, Elizabeth had alluded to threats Jens had made about turning himself in and committing suicide. This showed the extent of manipulation that Jens was capable of, if it was true. But more chillingly, Elizabeth claimed that after the murder, their relationship changed. He was no longer impotent. And what exactly did this signify? I mean, did he feel that the obstacle that emasculated him was now out of the way? Or was it like a signifier of something darker? A lust for something evil? I mean, either way, now he had total control. Well, at least according to Elizabeth's testimony. Across the globe, Jens was hearing everything Elizabeth was saying about him in court. And to him, it was the ultimate betrayal. Jens would later explain that at that point, he was obsessed with her, being the ideal, a type of hero for him. Her betrayal was unfathomable, and that's when everything changed. After the extradition to Germany attempt failed, Jens began to write, trying to make sense of things, as well as trying to come up with some sort of plan to avoid death in Virginia. Jens suggested to his legal team that they try to approach the European Court of Justice as a last-ditch effort. His parents also hired American attorney Rick Neaton to represent him. The argument was that if Jens returned to Virginia to sit on death row, his human rights would be violated. All that was left was for the case to pass back and forth between English courts and the European Commission on Human Rights. Now this would buy Jens time. With the possibility of Jens not having to face retribution, Elizabeth chose a new tactic, putting the blame solely on Jens. Now, she maintained that she never thought Jens would murder her parents, but Updike questioned her statements, asking point blank if she had requested the murders. He referenced yet another letter that Elizabeth had written, in which she referred to herself as Lady Macbeth. All you literature buffs will know that she was the wife of the titular character Macbeth, who ordered the murder of Duncan. With this reference, Updike was deliberately trying to paint Elizabeth as a mastermind, with Jens merely being a willing puppet. And it seemed likely. I mean, in one of those letters, Elizabeth wrote, 3 months before the murder, she told Jens that they could either wait until they graduated to leave her parents behind, or in her own words, and I quote, "We can get rid of them soon," end quote. On the stand, when confronted with this information, Elizabeth tried to explain the letter, saying she was resentful. In her opinion, she felt alone, rejected by her parents, sent away to various boarding schools, and just neglected. So she had turned to do drugs, as a cry for help. This eventually worked. I mean, her parents pulled her out of school and brought her back to Lynchburg, enforcing total control. They controlled who she was with, who she was friends with, where she went, and her schooling. They made a rule for Elizabeth: total obedience. And in return, they smothered her with affection. She was giving no privacy, with her mother often showing up unannounced in her dorm room. But then Updike introduced a major bombshell at the hearing. In the pre-sentence report, Elizabeth had made a statement that at one point she was in a full-blown sexual relationship with her mother. Yeah, you heard me. Her own mother. And when Updike addressed this in court, Elizabeth was silent for a very long time, like she had no clue what to say. And it could make or break the hearing. But instead, she tried to deflect, saying she didn't want to discuss it in public, but she had discussed it before, with Jens. In early 1985, when her parents were away, she had brought Jens to the Loose Chippings home. There she showed him nude photos of herself that her mother had allegedly taken, and she said her father knew all about it, but looked the other way. Jens was reportedly horrified and enraged and claimed then that he would kill Nancy and Derek. Updike was relentless in pursuit of the truth, and eventually Elizabeth gave in, and in a shocking statement declared that her mother never sexually abused her. Thank God. But was this the truth? I mean, so many lies and accusations had been thrown around. I mean, it's hard to believe. Was it real? It seemed more likely that Elizabeth had told Jens about the abuse to get him to agree to the murders. Maybe she was manipulating him, maybe, using the ideas of wealth and freedom. And of course, justice. Elizabeth also had a history of lying to people. This was clear. So was she trying to manipulate the courtroom with more lies? She had said that when she went to the movies, she had no idea Jens was going to kill her parents. But if that was true, then why would she buy 2 tickets that would establish an alibi? Reportedly, Elizabeth then went back to the hotel and ordered room service for 2, signing the bill with Jens's signature to further establish an alibi. So she had to have known, right? But Elizabeth was adamant that Jens had acted of his own free will. Trust me that the biggest shock was still yet to come. Elizabeth's half-brothers took the stand and introduced a new theory. They believed Elizabeth was present at the home when the murders took place. It was just all too convenient. In addition, Nancy had told her sons that she was expecting Elizabeth and Jens that weekend. More alarmingly, were found in the front and back of the home, and they were the exact brand that Elizabeth smoked. On the 8th of October 1987, the closing arguments were heard. Elizabeth's defense argued that she had changed, was remorseful, and shouldn't spend the rest of her life in jail. But of course, the judge was not convinced and pronounced her guilty, sentencing her to 90 years behind bars. It was a win for Updike, but he wasn't finished just yet. There was still one more person left to prosecute. England had refused extradition for Jens as long as the death penalty was still on the table. So Updike agreed with the conditions and removed the possibility, and in January 1990, 5 years after the murders, Jens arrived back in the United States to stand trial. It was a brand new battle. And of course, it was a total media circus and was being televised internationally. Jens took the stand before a packed courtroom, before the avid prosecutor Jim Updike, who had waited years for this moment. Updike immediately asked the golden question: did Jens go to the home of Nancy and Derek Haysom to kill them? Everyone expected Jens to confess, just as he had done before. That's not what happened. Instead, Jens simply said, no. The courtroom was stunned. I mean, for years he admitted guilt, but now, out of the blue, he denied any wrongdoing. So now Jens claimed that the couple had gone to DC for a getaway, and that Saturday, Elizabeth had confided in him, and she told him that she had a drug problem and that she owed a debt to one of her classmates. According to Jens, Elizabeth had told him that she needed to pick up a package in DC for this classmate and then drive it back to Charlottesville. Jens said that he would go with her, but Elizabeth said no and that they needed an alibi. So she instructed him to buy 2 tickets to 2 films, Witness and Stranger Than Paradise. Jens did as she requested, then went back to the hotel and ordered room service. As the night wore on and Elizabeth had not yet come back, Jens decided to go see the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Afterward, he went back to the hotel and Elizabeth arrived shortly after him. Jens alleged that Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, looked at him, and said that she had killed her parents and that the drugs had made her do it. Then, chillingly, she added, they deserved it. Jens' story was that Elizabeth had asked him for protection, but she didn't want to go to prison or be executed, and Jens, because he loved her, agreed. It was a real-life Romeo and Juliet, so much like the literature they loved so much. Jens stated that he got all the details of the crime from Elizabeth to make it more convincing when and if he confessed. He believed that he'd be fine as he had a diplomatic passport and would be sent back to Germany. He painted a picture of being naive and obsession, which to the court seemed very convincing. From that moment on, all bets were off. No one knew how the case was going to play out. The defense team entered the movie tickets as evidence. Surprisingly, Jens had held on to them, and this contradicted Elizabeth's version of events. While she had a vague recollection of the films and times, Jens knew them exactly. The prosecution had to find a new avenue of attack, and so the hair sample and sock footprint were presented to the court, but the hair sample didn't match Jens. However, the sock print was an exact match. Updike and Jens were facing off against each other in court in a formidable mood. Updike presented every single word of Jens's confession, statements, going through them word for word, and unfortunately for Jens, by taking the stand, he had subjected himself to cross-examination, which Updike had meticulously prepared for. In Jens's statements, he mentions things about the crime scene that were a little too accurate. He knew the position of the wine bottle on the table and what the Haysoms were eating that night. Jens had no choice but to admit that he'd said all of these things. But it was his third and final confession that was most crucial to Updike. On December 30th, 1986, a German prosecutor had traveled to London to interview Jens. There, he gave a detailed and recorded confession, which was later translated by the Bedford team. At that point, Elizabeth had already ended their relationship, yet despite this, Jens maintained that he had committed the murders, but why? Why would he stick to that story if the love affair was over? I mean, there was no need to protect Elizabeth any longer, but Jens claimed that he had lied to the officer in order to be extradited back to Germany. Next, Updike brought blood samples into evidence, and at the scene, a blood type O sample had been found, which matched Jens. However, as Jens pointed out, over 40% of the population had that blood type. I mean, it really could have been anyone. The prosecution didn't really have much to go on, apart from the sock print and the possibility that Jens's blood was at the scene. So, Updike turned to his next weapon, Elizabeth herself. The two would finally face off in court. When Elizabeth took the stand, Jens simply just stared at her. She relayed the events that Jens had told her, that he'd taken off his shoes at the scene, washed his hands, and tried to wipe up the scene. She claimed that Jens was lying about being innocent and that she had lied about something too. She had wanted Jens to kill her parents. Updike had used Elizabeth's testimony to the best of his ability, and now it was Neaton's turn. Before she took the stand, Elizabeth was sick. She was clearly nervous and knew they would try to point out the motive for her using the sexual abuse accusation. And now it was true that investigators had found the nude images of Elizabeth in her bedroom, and it seemed possible that there was indeed sexual abuse taking place within the home. The defense team drove this point home, saying the motive to kill was undoubtedly Elizabeth, and there was enough circumstantial evidence to place her at the scene. But who would the jury believe? Elizabeth or Jens? It was clear there was doubt, and the jury had difficulty reaching a consensus, but ultimately, they found enough evidence to convince them that Jens was guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, and when offered the chance to speak after all the sentencing, all Jens said was, "I'm innocent." It seemed that the issue was resolved, right, and retribution delivered. However, that wasn't the end. Some believed Jens. Firstly, authorities blindly accepted his confession without really checking the facts. Once Jens confessed, the investigation stopped. So there were facts that Jens got wrong, such as the position of the bodies and what Nancy was wearing. But others argued that even though he got the orientation of the bodies wrong, he knew exactly where in the house the bodies laid. And he knew the color of the clothes Nancy was wearing, if not the exact items. There were more discrepancies that were never really resolved. For example, Jens claimed that when he slit Derek's throat, Derek said something that would have been impossible as his windpipe was completely severed. How it doesn't make any sense. And as for the sock print, at that time, nothing much could be deduced apart from the size, which could be altered as the cotton smudged the ground. I mean, either way, there was doubt, and Jens' attorneys used this to their advantage. Smart. They tried to appeal the sentencing of 2 consecutive life terms several times, but were continuously rejected. But Jens continued to fight. I mean, becoming a model prisoner and even self-publishing a book titled Mortal Thoughts, which described his relationship with Elizabeth and the false confession for love. I mean, Jens was smart. Like, he knew how to work any system, and this particular system had a weak point: religion. Jens became involved in the Catholic Church. This helped him paint him as an innocent, or at least a reformed man. His Catholic connections almost paid off when in 2010, Governor Tim Kaine announced that his last act would be to arraign Jens' transfer to Germany. But this was soon squashed by his successor. Jens' hopes were dashed. There was really nothing he could do and no way out. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had set her sights on the parole board, hoping for an early release. But she too was consistently denied. Then, in 2016, after 30 years in prison, there was a brand new development. The governor of Virginia announced new tests on old evidence with the development of forensic technology. Included in these cases was the murder of the Haysoms. The blood found at the crime scene was tested, and to the surprise of many, Jens's blood did not match. There was none of his DNA at the scene, actually. The new findings also recorded AB blood with Y chromosomes, meaning that a second male was perhaps bleeding at the scene, along with the strange type O blood. That would signify 2 males were present that night. I mean, really, none of it made any sense. If that was the case, then 2 murderers would be on the loose. And once again, authorities dove back into the files to see if they could figure out the truth behind what had happened. And they discovered that in the 90s, Jens's legal team had named 2 men in the legal filings. They were called the 2 drifters. William Shiflett and Robert Albright lived in Central Virginia and had been arrested for a crime similar to the Haysom murders. Elizabeth somehow convinced these men to murder her parents. Both William and Robert were known in the drug circle, which, even in Virginia, was pretty small. If Elizabeth was part of that circle, surely she would have crossed paths with them. And so the DNA profiles of the 2 men were obtained, but they weren't a match. So officials were back at square one. I mean, who did this other DNA belong to? And as it turns out, the DNA didn't prove anything. All the samples were partial and likely contaminated at that point. So the likelihood that they all belonged to Derek Haysom was not real. So there was one factor that turned the tables. A forensic podiatrist would later examine the sock print to that of the bare print of Jens's foot, and conclusively determined that it was an exact match, judging by the ridges, the gaps between the toes, and the ball of the foot. I mean, despite this, Jens protested. Of course he would. And that's when it became political. I mean, the case had reached a point of international scrutiny and pressure. So much so that the former governor of Germany eventually argued on Jens's behalf in front of the Virginia Parole Board. Then, the Democrats got involved. In 2019, Governor Ralph Northam took position, and on the 25th of November, after 33 years in prison, he advocated for Jens to be granted parole. The board agreed, but that wasn't all. Elizabeth was also granted parole. This in no way declared either of them innocent. They were still convicted murderers, but it was determined they'd spent enough time behind bars. It was a shocking end to a 33-year-old mystery that really still had no real answers. Jens was deported back to Germany and Elizabeth back to Canada. Neither are allowed to set foot in the United States ever again. In Germany, Jens received a warm welcome with applause and cameras at the airport as he touched down. But Elizabeth did not find as much joy in her return. It was rather quiet, and it seemed that she wanted nothing more than to put this past behind her and just never speak of it again. I'm sure, right? They handled their release very differently. While Elizabeth retreated, Jens went on a publicity tour, doing interviews, book signings, and participating in the Netflix series about the murder. To this day, he denies his involvement. Public opinion is still split in 2, those who believe Elizabeth and those who believe Jens. Others think the theory that the pair committed the murder together holds more weight. As Nancy had said that she was expecting them both that weekend, she and Derek were murdered and Elizabeth's cigarette stumps were found on the scene. Let's not forget that. But considering the dynamic between Jens and Elizabeth, this would make the most sense. Neither one is trustworthy. Both prove themselves to be liars over and over and over again, and the alibi would be perfect. Buy the movie tickets ahead of time, order room service at 4 p.m., then drive to Bedford to the Haysom home. I mean, they're not dumb. Elizabeth and Jens had always wanted a shared destiny. They felt that they were superior and separate from the reality of morality. They wanted to be bound. And whatever the truth is, whoever wielded the knife, they will forever be bound in the worst way imaginable. Just like in the Shakespearean tragedies they just loved so much. In the end, it wasn't voodoo or black magic or satanic rituals, but rather the most vile expression of love.